Effendi said were the three prerequisites for success. And he said they're spiritual prerequisites. And the first one was rectitude of conduct. The second was what he called a chaste and holy life, which the House of Justice referred to as purity. And some of the Baha'is, when we talk about this in America, we like to think of the first one, the rectitude of conduct, as all the do's, and they like to think of the chaste and holy life as all the don'ts. Okay? Because if you look at the way it's, there's many things that you're prohibited from doing that you can't do, and so on. And this is true, that man has been given a physical nature which has certain desires or tendencies. Wouldn't you agree? And this is his animal nature. And so he has a nature and a desire for all kinds of things that are in the animal side. And this has to do with sex. It also has to do with all kinds of other things like love of luxuries and eating of food and all kinds. And it relates to all kinds of other cravings like gambling or alcohol addiction or drug addiction and so on. In other words, there is a whole host of things that your physical body is attracted to. That it kind of you want, or it feels good, or it's comfortable. Some people do it because they're depressed, or so some people, they eat food too much because they're depressed. Did you know that? They're depressed, so every time they get sad, they go and eat food, because tasty food feels kind of good, doesn't it? So if somebody hurts your feelings, so you go and eat an ice cream, okay? Is that right? And some people turn to gambling and alcohol and sex and so on. So all of us are attracted to something in the animal nature, the physical nature. And it so happens that religion comes along and says, spirituality requires you rising above your physical nature, your animal nature. And so in the world, a lot of people say, people that are not religious, they say, well, if you're naturally inclined to do it, why not do it? If it makes you happy, why not do it? It's natural. Some people say they study the animals, they say animals do it, so why don't we do it? Have you heard that argument before?
Yeah.
In fact, this is one of the most common arguments. We call it the argument of the perfection of nature. That nature is perfect, therefore whatever any animal does, man can do it. And it's a silly argument. Because if you think of all the things animals do, okay, I mean, even my dog does some pretty stupid things, so I'm not going to go into it. But some animals eat their young, they do all kinds of crazy things. And Baha'u'llah said to act like the beasts of the field is unworthy of man. That man was not created just to follow his animal instincts. But he is also a spirit in an animal body. And so he has these tendencies. And we are told that to try and rise above them is good for the spirit. It's good for the spirit. It's hard, but it's supposed to be hard. And so we shouldn't be so upset if we have these feelings. For example, Baha'u'llah says in the Kitab-i-Igan, he says that the true seeker should consume every wayward thought with the flame of his loving mention. Have you read that? Consume every wayward thought with the flame of his loving mention. So every time you have a wayward thought, the true seeker consumes it with the mention of God. But I was interested to read that he didn't say that the true seeker should not have wayward thoughts. He didn't say the true seeker should just no longer have wayward thoughts. So therefore he's basically admitting that you're still going to have wayward thoughts. He's admitting the truth. So everyone is going to have wayward thoughts. So you shouldn't feel guilty if you have them. I'm having wayward thoughts right now as we speak. So we're all having wayward thoughts.
Yeah.
So the point is that you can't get rid of your animal nature. And Yogi Effendi said in relation to sex, he says the Baha'i faith does not wish to suppress the sex impulse. And we don't think it's bad or evil or corrupt or something like that. He said we only look for its regulation and control. And the analogy that Abdu'l-Baha always uses for the animal nature of man is the analogy of a garden in relation to wild growth. Abdu'l-Baha said that if you look at the way in which plants grow in the wild, they grow a certain way, but look at a garden. A garden is the regulation and control, but a garden is not the suppression of nature. It's rather the channeling and the guiding or the regulation and control of nature. In other words, a garden is taking nature and making it more beautiful by putting it within certain boundaries. But if you just let it grow wild, it doesn't grow there. So this is the analogy that Abdu'l-Baha says. He says that we must regulate and control our nature, and by doing so, and by struggling, we will grow spiritually. And in many passages, both Vada Baha and Shoghi Effendi, referring to Baha'u'llah, he says that many of the laws relating to chastity have deep implications in the next world. He says they even, disobeying the laws of chastity, he says, can retard the progress in the next world. And you think, well, this is a physical thing that you do in this world, but how does it retard a spiritual, my body's gone, it's buried, in the next world my soul is retarded by disobeying this. So we have no idea what it is about the laws of chastity and how they have such an effect. And we may not know till we go to the next world. But it's kind of like I said yesterday, if you're backing out of a driveway and you can't see, and somebody has a different perspective and they say, go left or right, you obey them because you know they can see differently. The laws of morality are something like this. We need to trust that doing them will enable our soul to develop spiritually. The other thing is that struggling against something, being good for you, we can understand by looking at the physical world. Because if you go into a gym, if you go look into any gymnasium, you'll see that every machine in the gym is only designed to make something hard. Every machine is only designed to make some motion difficult to do. Isn't that right? Yeah. It's to obstruct you from doing something or to make it difficult. And we pay good money to go in there and make things hard for us. Now, why do we do that? Because we know the law or the science that when you struggle, if a muscle tries really hard to do something, the muscle tears. That's what happens. If you work a muscle too hard, the muscle tears, and it gets little holes in it. And by getting those little holes in the muscle, then it hurts. You push the muscle and it's sore. And then the next few days, the body grows into those holes. And then the muscle's a little bigger. And then the muscle has more capability of contracting. So you go back into the gym, tear it again. Okay? And so basically on purpose, you're making something hard and hurting. But because we know that that leads to muscular growth and health, we do it. And a lot of people do it so much that they're big, strong people and so on. And they have a saying that says, no pain, no gain. And the reason they say that is that unless you tear the muscle, it won't grow. So if you go into a gym and exercise just a little bit and you don't have any pain, you won't grow. You will only grow if you hurt the muscle. Did you know that? Yeah. So tomorrow go and hurt your muscle. And then you'll grow materially or physically, whatever. So it's the same with the spirit. Don't be upset if it's hard to obey these laws, because they cause spiritual growth. So morality, which seems to be a physical thing, is part of spiritual law. It's not part of physical law, because it doesn't hurt you physically. I mean, it could if you ate too much food maybe or something, but it doesn't really hurt the animals to behave like animals. They're fine. But it is a spiritual thing. Now, these first two are exactly in contrast to where the world is going. The world is going down, 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 down in terms of reliability, trustworthiness, fair-mindedness. Isn't that right, Justice? How about morality? Is it going down, 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 down? It's going right down there. The third, the Guardian said, was freedom from prejudice. Freedom from prejudice. Now, when he addressed the American believers, he talked particularly about racial prejudice. But in an earlier part of that, he said complete freedom from prejudice in their dealings with peoples of a different race, class, creed, color. In other words, there are many kinds of prejudice. Would you agree? And today in Singapore, there's surely some kind of prejudice. I don't know what it would be. I know in America we have prejudice against, like maybe a bit of prejudice, men against women, they feel they're superior. We have prejudice against the blacks. We have prejudice against the Native Americans. We have prejudice against immigrants. We have prejudice against other nations, foreigners. In other words, there's lots of prejudice in America. Other religions have prejudice against other religions. I'm sure that you have them here in Singapore. Is that right? Yes. What kind of prejudices do exist? Is there any class prejudice in Singapore?
Yes.
Is there?
Yes.
Is there any religious prejudice in Singapore?
Yes.
Is there any national prejudice against people from certain nations?
Yes.
Is there any racial prejudice?
Yes.
There is. Okay, so it applies here. Now, Shoghi Effendi identified prejudice as one of the three things that were killing America. In fact, he said the corrosion of prejudice, he says, has bitten into the fiber and attacked the whole social structure of American society. He's almost talking like a doctor, talking about, something has poison. And he said it should be constitutes the most vital and challenging issue confronting the American Baha'i community. So, what does vital mean?
Necessary.
The most vital and the most challenging. What does challenging mean?
Hard.
It's quite difficult. So, and then he describes in great details. Now, the House of Justice, in this letter that they wrote in 2010, referred to Shoghi Effendi's letter because many Americans might think that the prejudice is over. That Shoghi Effendi wrote that in 1938, and so therefore, now we've done so much, we've passed these laws and so on. And so the House of Justice addresses prejudice in today's world. This is just a year or two ago. They say, independent of the strengths and weaknesses of the measures taken by the American nation and the Baha'i community evolving within it, in addressing this particular challenge, the fact remains that prejudices of all kinds, prejudice of all kinds, of race, of class, of ethnicity, of gender, of religious belief, continue to hold a grip on humanity. So the House of Justice is saying, here nowadays, in 2010, prejudices of all kinds still hold a grip on humanity. And they say, while it is true that at the level of public discourse, great strides have been taken in refuting the falsehoods that give rise to prejudice in whatever form, it still permeates the structures of society and is systematically impressed on the individual consciousness. Now let me comment on that. The House of Justice is saying that there have been great strides taken, great progress has been made in the level of public discourse about the evils of prejudice in all nations of the world. And most people now think it's wrong. Even the word racist now is considered a dirty word. Someone says, you're a racist. Oh, I'm not a racist, because it's a dirty word. But they say, even though in public discourse we agree that prejudice is not a good thing, they say it still permeates the structures of society. It's still, the remnants of it still permeate. Although people can talk about it, but there's no action, and it still is impressed on individual consciousness. Now, so we should not think it's over, and we should not think that just believing we are free from prejudice is going to help. How many of you in this room are free from prejudice? Ready? Come on, raise your hand. No? No, but in fact, there's a lot of people that think they're free from prejudice in their minds. They think, I'm not prejudiced. There's a lot of people that think that. Recently, not too long ago, but a little while ago, I was with some friends of mine in America, and they were going to a very excellent seminar every week called the Institute for the Healing of Racism in America. And they would go every single week, and they would go week after week, 8, 10, 12 weeks. And they would talk about racism. These were all white Americans from the South in Tennessee. And after about 8 or 10 weeks, a friend of mine came to me and he said, I just love these seminars every week, the Institute for the Healing of Racism. It's changed my life. And when he said that, my face lighted up. I got really excited. I said, oh, it's changed your life. Because, I thought this was great. I said, so how has it changed your life? And he says, well, it's changed my life. I said, well, exactly how? He says, well, so I've just done completely different. I said, okay, well, you've been going now for 3 months. How many times have you had a black family come over to your house for dinner? He says, no, not once. I said, how many times have you gone over to a black family's house? I said, never. He said, have you gone out to a movie or gone fishing with a black family? No. Have you befriended a new black friend, in the last 3 months? No. And I asked several more questions like this. And finally, he said, it hasn't changed my life at all. and we both, he laughed, because, in other words, it changed his belief. It made him feel good. But there was no result. There was no effect. And this is when I came with the idea of an actogram. Unless you can act out your belief, what matters about your belief? In other words, if you are free from prejudice, you must think of a way that expresses that in the world without words. Don't go to your friend and say, I'm free from prejudice and my life has changed. Rather, do something that shows your freedom from prejudice. Take one of these groups, class, someone of a different class to you, lower or higher or whatever, or religion or race or whatever, and befriend them and smile at them or treat them well. Or, Abdu'l-Baha was doing actograms all the time. Did you notice that? He would come to America and he would go to the high society meetings and they would, like all white people, and he would just call a black man in and change the places and put them at the seat of honor and not say anything. And then he just gave a talk on the oneness of mankind as if nothing was going on wrong. He was always acting out freedom from prejudice. Until you act out freedom from prejudice, you are not free from prejudice. Maybe you are in your mind, but it must be action. It must be an actionable thing. And this is true of every single Baha'i teaching. Every single Baha'i teaching must be expressed in some form of action. We will never know the full potential of the human race until we stop discriminating against certain groups of people. Because you cannot know the potential of somebody if you don't give them full rights and equalities. I learned this very well when I was in university, and I read of a study in which they took a group of university students of all high intelligence, and they divided them in half, and they gave them all a piece of paper with a word on it. And one group got one word, which was, I think it was lemon, and they said, think of an anagram for that word, and when you have the anagram, raise your hand. An anagram is a different word but with the same letters. So lemon can make melon. Okay? The other people got another word, I can't remember what it was, but it's a very normal word, but there's no anagram in the English language for it. Okay, so they pass out all the paper, and they say, if you have an anagram, raise your hand, but don't tell anybody. So half the group all over raise their hand, another half they don't raise their hand. They say, okay, and they collect the paper. And then they hand out the paper again. And this time, everybody has the same word. Nobody has a different word, but no one's allowed to see each other's word. And it's a word that has an anagram in the English language, but it's not easy. You have to think a little bit. You have to concentrate and find it. So they give them that. And they say, now when you think of an anagram, raise your hand. So they watch everybody. And the majority of all those that got lemon raise their hand. And the majority of all those that didn't get it don't raise their hand. Even though now they all have the same word, and they're all of equal intelligence. Because one group was preconditioned by success, and the other was preconditioned by failure. They were taught that they have ability, and they were taught that they don't have ability, and now their abilities actually were different, just in 5 minutes. This is what we do to women every day. This is what we do to certain people of certain races every day, and of certain classes every day. We are preconditioning them to think that they can only do this or only do that. And Abdu'l-Baha said that until men and women are equal, for example, the wings of humanity can't fly. So by not, and this is true with every other form of prejudice. So freedom from prejudice is also an important thing to realize that humanity will not prosper and grow and develop until such time as we accord full equal opportunity to everyone. And so this is the third thing that you can do. Now, if you were to go out in Singapore tomorrow and carry out these three things in actograms. In other words, carry out trust. In other words, let's say that you're not allowed to say anything. You're only allowed to act it out. Okay, so how do you act out trustworthiness? How do you act out justice? How do you act out reliability? How do you act out freedom from prejudice? If you could only act it, you could never say it, then you will turn Singapore ablaze, because suddenly the darkness will be seen. Shoghi Effendi used a couple of analogies to get us to understand what our job is in the world today. The first analogy he used was that we are soldiers under attack. This is the first analogy he used. He said we're soldiers under attack. Now, I'll read it to you and then we'll talk about it. He said the friends must at all times bear in mind that they are in a way like soldiers under attack. The world is at present an exceedingly dark condition spiritually. Hatred and prejudice of every sort are literally tearing it to pieces. We, on the other hand, are the custodians of the opposite forces. the forces of love, of unity, of peace and integration. And we must constantly be on our guard, whether as negative forces enter into our midst. In other words, we must beware lest the darkness of society becomes reflected in our acts and attitudes, perhaps unconsciously. So, first of all, if you're a soldier under attack, has anyone ever been in a war? You have? Okay, but imagine if there's a war out there and you go outside. What is the first thing you're going to do when you go outside? Are you going to duck? Are you going to look around? You're going to put a helmet on? You're going to guard? Is that right? Are you going to be careful? You're going to dart from building to building? Is that right? Yeah. In the movies, that's how they do it. Isn't that right? Okay. So Shoghi Effendi says we have to be like that. And our children and our youth, we send them out into the streets. We're sending them out into a battlefield, according to Shoghi Effendi. Every time you turn that TV on, every time you buy that video game, every time you take them to the movies, every time they go to school with their classmates, they're soldiers under attack. Isn't that right? You have to be very careful. So this is the first thing we have to understand, that it is not easy. Shoghi Effendi referred to us as children of the half-light. Have you heard that phrase? Children of the half-light, because there's darkness in the world and we have the light of Baha'u'llah, the light of God's teachings, but it's only half, because we're in the two worlds. You got your foot here and your foot there. So this is the first analogy. When you wake up tomorrow, you're under attack. When you watch TV, when you look at magazines, when you look at the signs on the things, you're under attack. Is that right? Particularly you're under attack when someone comes at you with a particular negative attitude and you want to respond with that same attitude back. We'll come to this in a moment. So this is the first thing Shoghi Effendi said is required of us, to understand that we are under attack in the world today. Second thing he said is that we must learn to be heroes. In other words, we must have heroism. And let me read you, he says, these indeed are the days when heroism is needed on the part of the believers. Self-sacrifice, courage, and indomitable hope and confidence are the characteristics they should show forth, because these very attributes cannot but fix the attention of the public and lead them to inquire what, in a world so hopelessly chaotic and bewildered, leads these people to be so assured, so confident, so full of devotion. So he says, if we show the heroism to stand up against corruption, to stand up against dishonesty, to stand up against all these things, he says if we show that, the world will see that, because it's so rare. It's a light in darkness. He says, increasingly, as time goes by, the characteristics of the Baha'is will be that which captures the attention of their fellow citizens. How many of you capture the attention of your fellow citizens because you're a Baha'i? Anyone? You do? Okay, he says, as time goes by, it will happen more and more. He says, they must show their aloofness from the hatreds and recriminations which are tearing at the heart of humanity. How many of you live in an environment where there's hatred, recrimination, backbiting? In your work or your schools or your friendship, is there backbiting? What's an actogram that you can do when somebody's backbiting? You have to figure out a way that you can act in such a way that shows that you don't like backbiting without condemning that person. You know, without condemning that person. I remember Mr. Faizi. He hated backbiting. Mr. Hand of the Cause Faizi hated backbiting, but he also didn't like to call attention to anybody's faults himself. So if somebody backbit to him, he didn't want to say that's backbiting because then he would hurt their feelings. So it was quite hard for him. So he developed the habit, and many Baha'is have told me this, dozens of Baha'is, that whenever somebody backbit, Mr. Faizi would go to the bathroom. He would just say, excuse me, he didn't want to hear backbiting because he didn't even want to hear a negative quality of another person. Because Baha'u'llah said, breathe not the sins of others, so long as thou art thyself a sinner. In other words, breathing is taking in. It's not speaking out. He said he didn't want to do that. So when Baha'is would backbite, he would say, excuse me, I have to go to the bathroom. And after a while, they were wondering why Mr. Faizi always was going to the bathroom. And sometimes he would go to the bathroom, he would come back, and he'd say, I have to go back. And finally they got the idea. And yet, at the moment, I find that if you want to really quiet a party down, if there's a lot of noise, just go to the center of the room and you say, you know what's wrong with so-and-so? And start saying it, and everybody quiet, and they turn to listen. Because when there's any kind of gossip, we all turn and want to listen. Isn't that right? Isn't that right? We love that. We're the juicy gossip, you know. In other words, backbiting attracts attention. We can be something different. So we need to learn how it is that we can act in the world exactly the opposite. Shoghi Effendi continues, they must show their aloofness from the hatreds and recriminations which are tearing at the heart of humanity, and demonstrate by deed and word their profound belief in the future peaceful unification of the world. A third principle we find in Shoghi Effendi is that there is a certain thing that we should teach more than other things. There's a certain thing we should teach more than other things. So I want to ask you right now, does the world need the laws and principles of the faith? Raise your hand if you think the answer is yes. Does the world need the laws and principles of the faith? You all think that?
Yeah.
Okay. So should we go out and teach the laws and principles of the faith? Who thinks yes? You just said they need it, so should we go out and teach it? Well, let me read you what Shoghi Effendi says. It says, the people of the world not only need the laws and principles of the Baha'i faith, they desperately need to see the love that is engendered by it in the hearts of its followers. You see? You got the laws and the principles over here. He doesn't say don't teach them, but he says the world needs more to see the law and love. So the first thing you teach is your actions and your love. Love is the first act of teaching, not the exposition of the laws and the principles. And we were talking about this yesterday with someone, I can't remember, and we were talking about a discussion that I have with many Baha'is. They say, what do I say to this person in this situation? What do I, if someone says this, what's the right answer for it? And maybe the answer is not words. Maybe the answer is something else. And many times Al Baha, when he was asked, as I said to you yesterday, when he was asked, what do I say? He said, he didn't answer that question. He said, look into their eyes and love them and see me. In other words, the first principle of teaching is that you love the people. Now, this is very interesting to me because I often think about how the Bab declared to Mullah Hussain. I think about how the Bab declared to Mullah Hussain. We celebrate, May 23rd every year, isn't that right? And once again, we tell the whole stories, isn't that right?
Yes.
We tell the whole stories. But I think it's quite interesting the way in which the Bab announced it, because he, first of all, lovingly invited him to come to his house. He didn't tell it to him in the street. You notice that? Then when he invited him to the house, he welcomed him in and said, enter in peace. And then he washed him. He even washed his feet himself. Isn't that right? Then he fed him. Isn't that right? Okay. The manifestation of God, if he wanted to, he could have gone and stood on a mountaintop and announced to the multitudes. Or he could have gone to the city square and announced it. Or he could have just pointed to Mullah and said, instead, he gave him love and hospitality and food first. Did you notice that? Did he have to do that? Why did he do that? Why did he give him love and hospitality and invite him to his home? First of all, don't go washing everybody's feet. I don't think that's, maybe in Persian culture, maybe that was done in those days. In those days, because they had dirty feet. The Persians have dirty feet.
Those days.
No, I'm kidding. I'm joking. The point is that it was love and hospitality and food first, and then it was speech later. Even the Bab. If the Bab needs to do it, how much more? We got to give a whole lot more food than that. But would you agree? And so I often think if that is the way, this faith didn't begin with announcing on the mountaintop or swords. This faith began with love, hospitality, and food. I know that some of the Baha'is in Iran told me that there was a legend that the Persian Baha'is had some kind of poison or something in their tea. I know, I've heard this many times. They said that because the faith spread quite rapidly in Iran. There were 500,000 Baha'is before the revolution. How do we get 500,000 Baha'is in a finite country? They said it was because they had some special thing they put in their tea. And they're right. They're absolutely right. There was something special they put in it. It was love. It was love. Because Al Baha said, and this is very interesting, when some Western pilgrims were sitting at the dinner table with Abdu'l-Baha. They were about to eat, and he said to them, he said, before you take a bite, before you eat your food, if you have any ill feelings or hatred towards anyone, I want you to let them go before you eat. Because whatever spiritual mood you are in, that is strengthened by the physical food that you partake. Isn't that interesting? He said that's strengthened by the physical mood in which you partake. And then he said, this is why the 19-day feast is in the way it is, that you have the spiritual feelings and so on, then you eat the food, and the food actually strengthens it. And I thought this is interesting because so many of us, we're in a negative mood. We're driving home and we fast food, we stuff the food when we're angry, and we're feeding the anger. Because Abdu'l-Baha said, whatever spiritual mood you're in, you strengthen it with food. So I think it's very interesting. Show hospitality to people, and then give them some food. Then open your mouth and teach, and their hearts are ready. In the same way that maybe Mullah Hussein wouldn't have recognized the truth. Why did the Bab do all that? Can you understand that? The Bab taught with love. The Bab taught with love. So this is really what Shoghi Effendi is getting at, that the world doesn't only need the laws and the principles and the teachings, they desperately need to see the love. Now, another basic concept which we find in the Baha'i writings is that in the world there are two forces going on, and constantly Shoghi Effendi referred to it as the forces of light and the forces of darkness. And they both have a force. Let me read this here. The believers, to better understand their own internal conditions, should realize that the forces of darkness in the world are so prevalent and strong that their morbid and turbulent influence is felt by all. They should therefore consciously strive to be more loving, more united, more dedicated and prayerful than ever before, in order to fight the atmosphere of present-day society, which is unloving, disunited, careless of right and wrong, and heedless of God. Okay, so the world has all of these things, unloving, disunited, careless. So he said we have to strive more to be light in darkness. Basically then, what we are told is that a Baha'i has to dare to be different. We have to be different. If we do not stand out and make ourselves different, we are never going to succeed here in Singapore, we're never going to succeed in Malaysia, Australia, until a Baha'i is so different. Now, I'm going to read you a statement of Abdu'l-Baha about this concept of how different a Baha'i must be. Abdu'l-Baha says, O ye cohorts of God, through the protection and help of the blessed perfection, may my life be a sacrifice to his beloved. You must conduct and deport yourselves in such a manner that you may stand out among other souls, distinguished by a brilliancy like unto the sun. So he says that you have to somehow stand out and be as brilliant as the sun. How many of you feel you're as brilliant as the sun in relation to everyone else? Now, he goes on to say what should happen if you enter a city. He says, if any one of you enters a city, he must become the center of attraction because of the sincerity, faithfulness, love, honesty, fidelity, truthfulness, and loving kindness of his disposition and nature towards all the inhabitants of the world, that the people of the city may all cry out, this person is unquestionably a Baha'i, for his manners, his behavior, his conduct, his morals, his nature and disposition are the attributes of the Baha'is. Now, I have traveled all over the world. I've gone, I think, in the last few years, over 40 countries, and I've entered lots of cities. And so far, nobody has ever cried out when I walked into the city, this person is unquestionably a Baha'i. It hasn't happened yet. Has it happened to any of you? You just walk into the city, and, oh, he's a Baha'i. Okay. Now, you're laughing at that, but let me read you what Abdu'l-Baha says immediately after that. He says, until you do attain to this station, you have not fulfilled the covenant and testament of God. Thanks a lot. Like, thanks a lot. It hasn't happened yet. Okay.